As you might know, the webinar cycle was part of the project FACETS, Face Aesthetics in Contemporary E-Technological Societies, which is based in Turin, and whose PI, Massimo Leone, with the support of the European Research Council, put up this interdisciplinary research team that is mainly rooted in semiotics and in humanities in general, but sees the wisdom of integrating multiple sciences in investigation of these salient and very mysterious objects that is the human face. So, to make a long story short, he was also interested in cognitive science, and here they come through me. I'm a philosopher of science and in touch with cognitive scientists. So the fact is that I was interested in faces mainly because they were pivotal in the study of emotion, at least since Darwin, and surely at the end of the last decades of the last century. And that's where our speaker of today comes from. Juan LOAIZA is a young rising star of philosophy of the science of emotion. I met him when I first met him during a meeting of the European Society for Philosophy and Psychology. I think it was 3 years ago. And I realized that he was working on some topics that were very relevant, both for me and, more interestingly, for the current debates on emotion research, where, well, I don't want to make too many spoilers, but there are some interesting stuff that cannot be solved by neuroscientists and psychologists alone. Surprisingly, as it may sound, they and we all need philosophers, good philosophers of science that are not scared of dealing with scientific data and adjudicating them with an informed methodology and sound arguments. And that's why I am particularly pleased to have Juan as the last speaker today and the closing speech of this webinar. Juan has completed his PhD at the Berlin School of Mind and Brain, one of the most vivacious and interesting institutions for studying emotion and philosophy of science and mind in general here in Europe, but is now in Bogota, right, in Colombia, where he is an adjunct lecturer at the Universidad del Rosario. So I'm happy to have you here. I invite you to share your slide, and I say thanks in advance for what promises to be an interesting talk. Last remark about times. We have about 45, maximum 50 minutes for the talk. I will just tell you if we are running too much out of time, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for a short but hopefully useful Q&A. So I now mute myself and invite you to get the floor. Thanks.
Thank you, Marco, for that way too kind introduction. And thank you very much for the invitation. I am very honored to close this webinar series. I've seen some of the talks before me, and they're all amazing. And I hope I can keep up to the expectations. If not, I'm really sorry. So yeah, let me start by sharing the slides and giving a bit of an introduction to what I'm going to be talking about. Okay, so is the slide showing well? Yeah. Okay, perfect. So what I'm going to be talking about today, or at least a bit of context. So as Marco explained, I'm interested in philosophy of emotion, and particularly in applying philosophy of science to psychology and neuroscience of emotion. And I've been working on claims that appear in psychology and neuroscience, and I've been trying to analyze them with philosophical tools so that we can be clear how exactly can we solve certain debates or solve certain controversies in emotion research And while my work is mostly conceptual, I usually deal with empirical evidence. So what I'm going to be talking about today is precisely the finding of universality of facial expression and what can it mean for emotion research as a whole? What can we say if we found that there were universal facial expressions, and what are the limitations of such a possible empirical finding? So I'm going to start by again contextualizing a bit. So let's talk about universality as a finding in emotion research. Surely, universality, the claim for universality is one of the most debated experimental problems in emotion science, at least since the Ekman's and Friesen's work in the 60s. It is at least widely taught in a number of textbooks and introductory articles. And I mean, if you look up Wikipedia, it's going to appear the idea that there are certain emotions which are whose expression is produced and recognized across cultures. And these emotions are sometimes called the basic emotions, or they go by other names. But in any case, this alleged finding that there is such set of emotional expressions which are universal is very widespread. And of course, it's still controversial, but it's surely one of the crucial points in emotion research, at least in the past 50 years. And these debates, they also inform emotion theory. So when one goes into the question of what emotions are and how to define emotions scientifically, part of the evidence that gets mentioned frequently is the idea that, oh, Ekman and Friesen found some emotional expressions which are universal back in the 60s, and therefore emotions must be this or that, usually to motivate certain, say, biological accounts. I'm going to talk about that later. But yeah, in general, the idea is that when we want to define emotions, then universality is certainly one of the most interesting points of evidence. Currently, the debate takes the form mostly in the debate between basic emotion theory and constructionist accounts. If you see how constructionists often introduce their accounts, they start by criticizing the universality findings that basic emotion theorists claim that are true. So for a great example of this is, for example, Lisa Feldman Barrett in one of her talks, I think 2018, she gave a talk for Google, and the first 10 minutes of the talk it's just criticism of universality. Before she motivates, through that criticism, she motivates her own account, which rejects basic emotions, right? So this is one way in which the debate is presented currently. And what I'm going to claim in this talk is that this finding of universality, even if we had the best evidence available, even if we were super good at methodology, it cannot decide certain crucial issues in emotion theory. And particularly, it cannot decide two important problems when it comes to defining what emotions are. First, it cannot decide whether emotions are discrete entities or whether emotions are distinguished dimensionally from one another. And second, it cannot decide whether a set of emotion categories is the best or not. So what I'm going to call emotional taxonomy. And if this is true, if findings of universality cannot help us decide for these two problems in emotion theory, then I think that universality is best kept separate from issues regarding what emotions are. So contrary to what the tradition has tried to do in connecting findings of universality to the question of what emotions are, I think these are two separate problems, both interesting in their own right, of course, but I think we're good in separating these two things. The way in which I'm going to proceed, it's always presenting an outline, is starting by presenting some definition of universality and trying to analyze the conditions for this. So what makes this definition true, or what would make universality as a claim? What would make it true? Then I'm going to try to discuss some ideas on what would follow if universality were true, at least at a conceptual, logical level. So I'm not gonna debate that much whether I take it that universality is the case or not. I think that's an empirical matter. I'm just gonna assume that if it were true, then what would follow from that? And then I'm gonna discuss, I'm going to drift a bit away from the main point for a second, just to make clear a rhetorical point, which I think is very important, and it's that usually when scientists discuss universality, they discuss it at a methodological level. So the debate usually is which is the best way to gather evidence for or against universality. I'm going to present some of these arguments, but I'm going to make it clear that my argument is not of that type. What I'm going to try to pursue is more of a conceptual argument. Then I'm going to talk about the idea that what follows from the fact that there are, or from the presumed fact, that there are certain specific expressions universal across culture, and whether that can help us decide discreteness or taxonomies. I'm going to talk about attribution, so people attributing meaning to a given emotional expression. From these two main arguments, then I'm going to conclude with some recommendations, both for emotion theory and emotion science as a whole. So let us start with defining what I take universality to be. I think the most interesting analysis at a conceptual level of universality is due to James Russell, and particularly his article from 1994, in which he tried to criticize Ekman and his view that emotions are basic partly because there are certain universal expressions. And he analyzed what he calls the universality thesis in terms of 4 related but distinct propositions. He calls them, or I'm gonna label them, I think following him textually, this is the universality of facial movements claim, the expressiveness of facial movements claim, the universality of attribution claim, and the correctness of attribution claim. I'm gonna define each of these at a time, starting by the universality of facial movements, of course. So Russell first starts saying, well, universality, when people say that there are universal facial expressions, first of all, they might mean that there are specific patterns of facial muscle movement that occur in all human beings, right? So one way of thinking about this is in terms of precisely Ekman's basic emotions, or particularly basic emotional expressions. So if you take, say, these 6 patterns of facial expression, you can describe each of these patterns, as Ekman is trying to do, by mentioning patterns of action units, right? Muscle movements in the face, which are discrete, and therefore one could be, well, this is AU number X, Y, and Z, and then you can have these patterns of facial muscle movement. But the crucial point here is that universality claim at this point is that there are patterns that occur everywhere, but we are not saying anything yet about whether they correspond to a specific emotion or not. We're just saying there is such thing as a facial movement pattern, period. And you could say that. I mean, that could be an interesting claim on its own. But of course, this is not what people that claim universality have in mind, or at least not the whole story. But this is at least the first and perhaps the most important ingredient when it comes to universality of facial expression, the idea that there is such thing as a subset or a set of facial movement patterns. Now, of course, since this is partly motivated by emotional research, then you could go a bit beyond this very basic claim and say, well, those facial patterns, which exist across cultures, they now correspond or manifest the same emotions. So now, in this view, in this second claim, the expressiveness of facial movements claim, we have a correspondence claim. We are saying not just that there are such patterns, but those patterns correspond to something that we call emotions, and they do so homogeneously and across cultures. So now what we're doing is taking those patterns and basically connecting them to an emotion category, right? So now we're saying, oh, the set of action units which makes you smile, that is tied to happiness. And this other one that makes you kind of lower your eyebrows and like sad face, right? Then it's sadness and so on. So now we have 2 different claims. One, the existence of a pattern, and second, the correspondence of that pattern to an emotion category. Russell also distinguishes for other 2 further claims, which are really interesting for our purposes, which are the universality of attribution claim and the correctness of attribution claim. The universality of attribution claim is the claim that observers everywhere attribute the same meaning to those facial patterns, right? So now not only do those facial patterns exist, and not only do they correspond to emotions, but actually people are they attribute a uniform meaning to those patterns. And lastly, Russell claims, the last claim would be that they do so correctly. So that they're not systematically wrong when they see a face, and subjects claim, oh, that's a sad face, right? That attribution usually is correct. So we have these four claims, and now the idea would be let's think about how they relate to one another, whether there are interesting logical relations that we can uncover that can help us identify how this might be true or false. So again, following Russell, he thinks that the correctness claim, the last of the claims, presupposes all other three. That for correctness to be true, then there have to be universal attribution of facial expressions, and there has to be also a given correspondence between specific patterns of facial expression and emotion categories. I think this is a bit too much. I think this is not true. I think there may be specific patterns across cultures, so there may be some specific expressions, but the correspondences to emotion categories don't have to be one-to-one, or they can even be on the fly, such that there is not like homogeneity in categories across cultures, and yet people might be correct whenever they see a face. They might correctly identify whatever it is there is to identify behind that face, whether it is an action tendency, whether it is a conscious state, or whatever. People may do so correctly, even if there is no specific pattern to which that expression is always tied. This means that this last claim only presupposes that people attribute meaning to expressions in an uniform way, universally speaking, or at least cross-culturally speaking, to be more precise. But of course, just to be fair, it is unlikely, sorry for the typo there, it is unlikely that 1 or 2 are false and 3 and 4 are true. That is, it is unlikely that there are no specific patterns across cultures that correspond to emotions, and that there are no such things, but people nonetheless attribute emotion homogeneously and correctly most of the time. But logically speaking, these are separate things, with the existence of a specific pattern is independent logically from whether I take a signal and attribute it a meaning and do so correctly under some definition. So this is the first important clarification to make. Second, and maybe some of you are already thinking, especially if you're familiar with philosophy, the first three claims are purely descriptive, whereas the fourth introduces some sort of normativity. What I mean is, 1 to 3, they describe possible states of affairs. So whether or not there are patterns that exist across cultures, whether or not they correspond one-to-one to specific emotion category, and whether or not people attribute a meaning to those patterns, those are all descriptive claims. And the way to determine whether they are true or false is just by testing empirically. So we go across cultures, we do some tests, and presumably if we are good at methodology and we do those tests correctly, we will find out whether these things are true or false. However, claim 4 also presupposes a descriptive statement, of course, namely that people attribute the same meaning across cultures, which is the third claim. But it goes beyond that, and it claims that people are successful at attributing that meaning, which means that claim 4 already introduces some criterion for correctness, or what counts to be successful at identifying that meaning. And therefore, for 4 to be true, for this last correctness claim to be true, we have to be clear about what is it exactly that we're looking for when we attribute a meaning to an expression. So what does an expression mean, let's say? Of course, that might be answerable, but at the very least, it involves a normative argument. So this is a claim that is not purely descriptive, but it has to do with some normative concern. Lastly, and most importantly, notice that the first two claims, they concern specificity of facial expressions and of emotional patterns, whereas the last two claims, they concern attribution. And one way to make this distinction clear is to notice that claims 1 and 2 are about the existence of, say, a facial muscle movement pattern, of a neurophysiological pattern that face is tied to or corresponds to, and you can test all those claims in individual subjects. So whether or not there is such thing as a facial action unit movement pattern, then you can just test individuals producing faces, individually speaking, and just maybe do some EMG readings and find out whether we have those common patterns. Whereas if you take a look at the other two claims, it is about how other people, not the one producing, but about how others take that face and assign a meaning to it. So to test 3 and 4, you need at least two subjects. One would be the producer, another one would be the recognizer, let's say. And then you would test whether the recognizer does really recognize, sorry for the redundancy, recognize whatever emotion or underlying state that expression is supposed to be expressing, right? So for the second claims, you need at least two people, even if it's just one is a stimulus and the other one is the experimental subject. But in any case, you need two people. Whereas the first one, you're just talking about individual states and whether those individual states are individuated by a specific pattern or whatnot. So from this analysis, we can now put together a version of the universality thesis along the following lines. So we can now formulate this following claim. There is a set of patterns of facial muscle movement that, first of all, occur in all human beings. Second, they correspond to specific emotion patterns, whatever those may be. 3, people across cultures attribute the same meaning to those facial muscle movement patterns. And 4th, they do so successfully under some definition of success. So this could be like the general universality thesis claim. And then if we follow what we have said before, we have two subclaims, which are the ones I'm going to focus for the rest of the talk. One would be the specificity claim, so that there is a set of patterns of facial muscle movement that occur in all human beings and that somehow correspond to specific emotion patterns. And 2 would be the attribution claim, that people across culture attribute the same emotional meaning to the same expressions and they do so successfully. So by distinguishing these two, we can now ask, okay, if either of these is true, what would that entail for definitions of emotions? That's where I'm heading at. Before we do that, however, let's think about some possible consequences of universality or how it has been used in emotion theory. And as I said before, this universality claim is usually used to motivate accounts of neurophysiological specificity. So the idea that emotions must be somehow concrete and specific patterns of neurophysiological activity, given that we have found cross-culturally produced and recognized expressions. And here I'm going to quote Ekman himself in putting forward their argument. So in 1993, he said something like, a focus on universals and expressions at the time he's writing this was inconsistent with the then reigning, as of the 1960s he's referring to, with the then reigning view that all that differentiates one emotion from another is our expectation about what we should be feeling. Here he's thinking about the Schachter and Singer experiments. But once expressions were found to be emotion specific, it made sense to re-examine the issue whether there might also be emotion specific physiological changes. So part of what motivated him to pursue the idea, oh, there must be something at the autonomic nervous system level that individuates emotions, that must be the case because we have observed some form of universality. Likewise, people rejecting specificity, they usually attack findings of universality as well. So the one way in which they reject the claim that emotions have specific patterns at a neurophysiological level is, as I mentioned before, like Feldman Barrett does in her talk, start by attacking the claim that there are universal expressions. And here I'm going to quote Erika Siegel and colleagues. Again, classic constructionist rhetorical view of basic motion theory, but it is really informative in this context. She says something like, the classical view hypothesizes that the pattern of autonomic nervous system changes is highly similar across instances of the same emotion category, reflecting some central emotional state. This pattern is hypothesized to be consistent across contexts and individuals regardless of age and culture. An ANS pattern should be specific to one and only one emotion category. There is general consensus within this classical view that anger, disgust, fear, happiness, and sadness qualify as basic categories, meaning that they have a biological fingerprint and are universally expressed and recognized. So you can see that also for opponents, they tend to tie together neurophysiological specificity with universality. Now, why would one think that? Like, what's behind that sort of inference? Ekman himself is very clear about how he has used this inference before, because he thinks that universality establishes, first of all, that emotions are discrete entities, meaning that those ANS patterns, they have to be categorically different from one emotion category to another, so that whatever happens in your body when you're sad is categorically distinct from what happens in your body when you're happy or when you're afraid or when you're angry. And he says so very, very explicitly. Says the research on facial expressions has also shown the utility of conceiving of emotions as separate discrete states, such as fear, anger, and disgust, rather than simply as positive versus negative states, or even more simply as differing only in respect to arousal. So what I take this to mean is that he thinks that if universality is true, then the correspondence between an expression and a pattern of neurophysiological activity can be cashed out as the one-to-one correspondence between emotions and some discrete pattern. So he's inferring from the correspondence of expression, he's inferring the discreteness of emotions itself, right? Which is part of the claim that I'm going to make later. I think this inference doesn't hold. And that's important for emotion theory because this is one of the crucial issues about how to define emotions, whether we do so categorically, we do so discretely, or we do so dimensionally. He also believes that universality can determine how many emotions there are. And again, I'm going to quote him here. If our definition of emotion were to require a distinctive expression so that conspecifics can know instantly from a glance how a person is feeling, then we need look only to the evidence on how many emotions have distinctive expressions to determine the number of emotions. So he says it explicitly, like we can know how many emotions there are by looking at how many expressions there are and that are produced and recognized universally. So again, important wedding between two ideas, which I think are best kept separate. To be fair to Ekman, you could read this initially as a deductive inference, right? You could say, oh, he's tying these things way too much, and you can relax a bit that relationship and say, not that universality entails discreteness or the universality necessarily leads to a specific emotion taxonomy. You could maybe relax a bit and say, well, maybe it suggests inductively or abductively even the best explanation for universality would be that emotions are discrete, or the best explanation would be that emotions are that the taxonomy of expression is exactly the same as the taxonomy of emotion. And this is what the Kellner does very well. He clarifies, I'm gonna again cite here. He says, it is not true that most basic emotion theories researchers hold the simplistic view that the evidence of universality necessarily implies evolution by natural selection, instead acknowledging that evidence of cross-cultural similarity might also be explained by cultural processes common to cultures across the world. Instead, the study of emotional expression has moved away from such Manichaean distinctions, expression is either shaped by evolution or culturally constructed, to more systematic approaches to understanding how both classes of processes shape emotional expression in compelling ways. So even though Ekman in 1993, he seems really explicit about certain inferences he's making, nowadays basic emotion theorists, they're much more nuanced about how they're proceeding. So it would be really unfair of my side to just go with the old Ekman view when we have much nuanced accounts of how universality relates to these issues. Nevertheless, I think there's still an inference being made from universality to discreteness and to a particular emotional taxonomy that we have to analyze. So making clear that these claims have been used in the past in this way, let me clarify again what I'm going to try to argue by contrasting it with a methodological point. So remember that I want to argue that universality does not establish discreteness and that it does not establish a taxonomy of emotions. And while I think this has been useful in the past, I think we have to reevaluate this inference at the moment. But to make this point, I'm going to contrast it with methodological criticism. So if you look at papers that criticize universality, here I'm going to mention three important references. And all of these have something in common. All of these references, the strategy The argumentative strategy pursued is the claim that data, again, as I said before, that data wasn't gathered in the best way possible. So if you look at how they're proceeding, I'm going to quote here Maria Gendron, which I think is the most up-to-date account of this criticism. She points out that, for example, classic studies use researcher-provided words so that subjects arrive to the study, and then they're given a list of words which are pre-chosen by the researcher. And then those list of words presumably prime certain consensus. Therefore, statistically speaking, universality cannot be said to be true, because if you eliminate that list, then you might not have the same consensus, right? This is, again, one of the most important pieces of criticism for universality claims. Russell 1994 also has this argument. There's also the argument that other features of the task, so the way in which the pictures are chosen or arranged when you put pictures of facial expressions in front of subjects, that the way in which you do it artificially increases agreement. So you cannot say that because people agree, therefore there is such thing as universally recognized and produced expression. It's just an artifact of the task. Also, others have pointed out that in the way in which people give instructions to participants, they may be leaking information about, say, discreteness, about correspondences that there may be, so that these findings can be called into question. And lastly, the main argument is that if you solve these issues, so if you use other methodologies, if you use other tests, then you have conflictive evidence, because you may have studies showing that there is no universality, or you may have different lists of emotions that are presumably universal. I think in this regard, Professor Jack's talk was fantastic. She showed a bunch of interesting new methodologies to study facial expression. And if you haven't seen that talk, I really invite you to go see it, because she does a way better job than I would in explaining all these nuances. But as you can see, all this criticism, all these arguments, and all that discussion, I think this is mostly correct. I mean, I think I buy most of these concerns, but I'm not a methodologist at all. So I cannot really take issue with them. But from my point of view, even if methodology was perfect, even if we had great methodology, we could still ask, well, what would that show? Like, if you gather data in the best way possible, what would that mean? And my working hypothesis is that it doesn't show what many take it to show. So I'm going to assume from now on that methodology is great, that people are perfect scientists, and they gather information in the best way possible. And yet, I think we cannot make the inference they want to make. Okay? So now let's get to the crux of the issue. So first of all, remember that I distinguished between universality in the sense of specificity of facial expression and in the sense of attribution. And I'm going to start with the specificity claims. So first of all, let us think about whether the existence of specific expressive patterns entails that emotion categories must be discrete or not. And my strategy is going to be, well, let's think about the negation of that. What if we have a specific emotion facial movement pattern, and that pattern corresponds to some non-discretely individuated emotion? So let's assume that emotions are not discrete categories, that they are individuated in some affective space, say a space of arousal and valence, or more dimensions if you want. Does that entail some sort of contradiction? Not at all. Let's think about a clear case. I think the example of smiling is great for this. So you could say that smiling, or a genuine smile, it's clearly a specific pattern of facial expression. And you could even think that this pattern obtains everywhere. It's very natural to smile. But you could say that smiling corresponds to a number of emotions, all of them that are positive, for example, or some area inside the positive emotions. So here I have a made up plot, but consider this. So let's say smiling corresponds to that area in affective space, in a space of arousal and valence. And look, that if you see in detail, like that area, it corresponds, bits of that area lie in the area for joy, some of them that lie in the area of ecstasy, and some of them in the area of pride. And you could say perfectly, well, smiling corresponds to that area, right? So smiling could be a specific facial expression, such that the first claim would be true, but that wouldn't entail that these emotions that corresponds to are discrete. You could perfectly have areas in affective space corresponding to those expressions. So this means that you cannot infer from specificity that emotion categories have to be discrete, right? You need other types of evidence to pursue that claim. And you can apply that to dimensional theories themselves. So if you think how dimensional theories cash out expressions, you can see that most of them are compatible with specificity of the existence of specific facial expressions that occur universally. So if you think about, say, dimensional appraisal theories of the sort of like the Klaus Scherrer or Agnes Morse pursue, they cash out emotions in terms of different components, and one of them is the expressive component. And you might as well say in that theory, well, the expressive component is divided in 6 expressions that occur everywhere. But given that all other components can vary widely, then you can individuate an emotion dimensionally by all these other values, even if the expressive component can only take, say, 6 or 7 values, right? So the fact that the expressive component is limited does not entail that emotions have to be discrete. And the same holds for constructionism. So if you go psychologically constructionist, then given that they emphasize the fact that emotions are individuated in context, so depending on where you are and which concepts fall under that category, then in a given context, one specific expression may apply to one emotion, and in another situation, it may apply to another. But then that expression might be universal. That expression might be specific and appear everywhere in the world. And yet, given that we can have different correspondences all around the place, then you cannot from there infer that it has to correspond to one discrete state. So if this is true, generally speaking, we can say that the claim that there is specificity of facial expression, the specific expressions may be related to areas in some dimensional space, and therefore they need not correspond to discrete emotions. So it's not the claim that they do not, but the claim that they need not, and therefore the inference from universality to discreteness is unwarranted. Generalizing this argument to all other expressions, you could have something like this, right? So you could have expressions tied to different areas, and that would be compatible with evidence for universality. So this would be the first big claim. Now, if we think about the other question that I posed before, whether you can decide how many emotions there are, so an emotion taxonomy. Before an objection. So you could have the idea that even though specificity is true but discreteness may not, suppose that's the case, then why would specificity of expression be true, right? Like, why would there be universals if emotions weren't discrete? It's part of the rhetoric that basic emotion theorists sometimes pull off. And part of the, say pull of this sort of argument is the idea that if an expression is universal, then whatever is universal has to be evolutionarily determined somehow. So that if something appears across cultures, it must be because evolution did something at some point, such that we have that expression. And therefore, universality claims suggest some evolutionary mechanisms in order to explain cross-culturality, right? So you could say that by abduction, by best explanation, that discreteness is still the best explanation for universality, given that discreteness is tied to evolutionary mechanisms. However, the fact that expressions in an evolutionary sense would have signal value, which would be like the crucial claim here, the fact that expressions allow you to communicate certain states of an organism, that does not mean that you have to communicate discrete states. So they could have signal value, even if all they were communicating was, oh, this organism is in such point in affective space. It's in such state that of arousal and valence and other dimensions that you may add to the space. And that's might be useful for survival. So you don't need discreteness to hold an evolutionary account. And therefore, this argument is just that, well, if UTS is true, if there are specific facial patterns that occur in all human beings that might suggest an evolutionary account of emotions, but it does not necessarily entail a discrete account. So that would be the first argument. Now going to the emotion taxonomy bit. So you could say that the existence of specific expressions that occur in all human beings could suggest some way of organizing emotions. And this could be because even if emotions corresponded to rest in affective space, so even if you ditch discreteness, it may still be the case that the way in which you categorize and conceptualize emotions has expression as one of its core components. One way to think about this is in terms of folk concepts. So you can think about this using your everyday language. So in everyday contexts, you could say, well, expressions are part of the behavioral criteria by which you apply a given concept. You could say so in a more behavioristic fashion, or you could also go a bit Wittgensteinian and say, well, the expression in itself is part of what the concept is. It's part of the rules of application and so on. So you may think expression is tied to a specific way of carving up emotion space. Or scientifically speaking, you could say, well, it's part of the behavioral components, just as the appraisal theorists would have it. You could say that part of the constituents of an emotion are its expressions, and therefore that if we have differences in expression, that suggests differences in emotion category. Again, this is what I take Ekman to imply in the quote before. Now, this might be suggestive, but still I think it's rather weak. And one way to think about it is by thinking about other forms of specificity. So first of all, UTS, so the claim that there are universal expressions, does not necessarily entail a concrete taxonomy, because first of all, you could have a specificity at a neural, physiological, or behavioral specificity, right? You can have neurophysiological patterns, and even if you didn't have universal expressions, that might still suggest that that emotion is just one package, right? That you have only one category. Or even if you had, for example, one particular pattern of ANS activation corresponding to 2 or 3 different expressions, then that would still suggest that you only have one emotion. It's just that one emotion is expressed in different ways, right? So the fact that you have differences in expression does not lead to division of categories, right? Which is what determines emotional taxonomy. What makes happiness and sadness different is not just that the expression is different, but rather something else. And also, even if you had universality of expression, that wouldn't entail a concrete taxonomy, because if other things were different, you would be rather forced to divide the category. So if you had one single expression tied to very, very different patterns of ANS activity, you would still be compelled to distinguish two different emotions having the same expression, as we do in the case of joy, ecstasy, pride, and so on. So in the case of positive emotions, even though all of them are expressed somehow in smiling, the differences lie in other ways of distinguishing, right? Other sorts of criteria. And if this is the case, then we could say that correspondence with a specific pattern of expression, it seems weak evidence for specificity at other levels. Elsewhere, I have argued that specificity at other levels is also problematic. But at the very least, what I want to claim at the moment is that the claim for universality does not entail other forms of specificity or correspondence. And therefore, it cannot decide two important, crucial issues. So at this point, I have talked about 2 of the 4 claims that Russell distinguished, right? So we would have to say something about attribution claims as well. So let us shortly discuss these attribution claims in a bit. So as I said before, these claims are claims about what subjects take it to be the meaning of an emotional expression, right? What does that expression signal? And of course, the question you have to answer before you analyze that claim is, well, what do expressions really mean, right? What is that is signaled? What is it? How is it individuated? And you could do that in 2 ways. So you could go a bit internalist and say, well, expressions just mean some concrete emotional state, individuated by whichever means. So it might be a feeling state, a conscious state, or it might be a neurophysiological state, however you cash out emotions, but expressions just mean that an organism is in that emotion, period. Or you could go broader, go more externalist and say, well, expressions signal more than that concrete emotional state. It means that the organism is in some situation, that there is some object in the environment such that blah, blah, blah. And that might provide some evolutionary value, right? So we're going to think about the consequences of attribution claims in terms of discreteness and taxonomies. Then we would have to first think about how do we individuate the emotions behind those expressions. If you go the internalist route, so if we say, well, it's just that emotional state, then that's again compatible with discreteness and dimensionality, because either way, you're saying, well, emotions just express either that discrete category or they express that point in dimensional space, right? So in either case, you cannot decide between these two issues. And the problem is that this requires previous criteria for individuation, which is precisely what's at stake when you discuss discreteness versus dimensionality, right? So if you don't have criteria to individuate that which an expression is supposed to mean, or that which an expression is supposed to express, then attribution doesn't say much about your problem, right? So you have to postpone the question of whether universality helps one or the other theory. If you go the externalist route, then this is also very, very interesting. It suggests that our emotional taxonomy should take external factors into account, because if that which an expression expresses includes information about the environment, then you might think that a definition of emotion should also involve things about the environment, right? That a definition of emotion should also be somehow extended. And that's interesting for emotion theory in its own right. But again, this still does not decide between discreteness and dimensionality, because you can have views of both sides that still pair well with context sensitivity and with environmental factors. So this might help you in defining emotions, but the issues that I have mentioned would still be there undecided. So if I'm right about all of this, then to start wrapping up, then let's answer the question. What does universality tell us about emotion? Well, first of all, it does not establish neither of the questions between discreteness and dimensionality, and it does not decide the taxonomy of emotion. And if this is true, then traditional debates about universality seem to be a bit misguided, because they have focused too much on universality where they should be discussing something else. The reasons why I think this is true, just to rehearse a bit, is that the existence of specific universal expressions is compatible with both discrete and dimensional views, such that you don't know what expressions correspond to, and that specificity of expression cannot decide for a given taxonomy, right? And a similar argument holds for attribution claims. So far, this is all very negative and towards the dark side. But then let's try to say something positive, right? Because we have to end 2020 in some positive note. It's enough negativity this year, so let's try to do something positive. So what does it really tell us? So for one, I think if we found universality, if it were the case, then for one, that would be interesting in its own. That's a pretty cool finding, and we have to give it the credit it deserves on its own right. I think universality is really important for a lot of issues, but it's also interesting in its own. Now, it does suggest some evolutionary explanation, right? So the argument from there is a universal expression to that expression might be determined from some evolutionary mechanism. I think that's an interesting inference. And I think, again, that doesn't decide other issues, but that does inform some debates in emotion theory. And lastly, it might inform some decisions between whether you individuate emotions internally or if you extend them somehow into the environment. Given that if an expression communicates information about the environment, you might include that information as part of the definition of an emotion. So you can pull off some interesting things out of finding universality. It's just that you cannot decide everything, and you cannot decide very important things, right? So where does this end up? I always like to finish my arguments with some sort of recommendation, because philosophers, we tend to be all abstract in our ivory tower, and let's try to bring this down if you're a emotion scientist or emotion theorist. So first, I think it's important to keep in mind that we don't have to overstate universality, right? That the study of expression is interesting, but there is such a thing as a limitation as well. So if you're interested in the nature of emotion, I think it's interesting to look at other sources of evidence, not just universality. Again, if you think back on the debate between basic motion theory and constructionism, I think it's a debate where universality is often overstated. And I think to advance that debate, we can look elsewhere and leave the issue of universality aside. Second, even though universality might suggest an evolutionary account, it cannot decide whether there are 6, 7 emotions or whether these are discrete or dimensional. That means that if you are interested in categorization, then again, you might look at universality, but with a limited scope. But if you're interested in universality, the upshot is you don't have to solve emotion theory, right? You don't have to solve all the issue between discreteness and dimensionality and so on in order to test whether there is universality. You can go around and test universality on your own. Just consider that you do have to tie it with some evolutionary account, or at least discuss the idea that it might be related to evolution. But a number of problems in emotion science, or emotion theory at least, you can leave aside. And lastly, I think we are best keeping universality separate from questions about what emotions are. Again, if you pursue universality on your own, that's fantastic and that's super interesting on your own. But you can leave emotion theory aside to some degree. And if you're interested in emotion theory, then universality, you don't have to overstate it, and you can also leave some of these issues aside. So yeah, I think that would be the wrap up. Thank you very, very much, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you for the very clear presentation. It was most interesting for me also because I think I disagree on several points, and we as philosophers would love to disagree. So that's just wonderful.